As the NFL season approaches, you're starting to do your research and you're trying to see who you want on your fantasy football team and who you don't want. In today's video, we're going to talk about 10 people that I think you should avoid in your fantasy football drafts. Now, by no means am I saying these players are trash, are they useless in fantasy football, don't even bother getting them on your team. I just think they're currently being overvalued or overdrafted in fantasy football. I just don't like their ADP at the moment. Now tomorrow, we're going to cover 10 people that I think are must-draft players, people that are going way too low in drafts that you guys should definitely scoop up. But for today's sake of the video, and even for tomorrow's, we're going to stick in the top 8 rounds. Just the top 8. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist for me to tell you, hey, don't draft Cole Beasley in round 13 or David Johnson in round 14. No offense to those two guys, but we're going to stick in the top 8 rounds because those are going to be the people that you're going to be starting each and every week for the most part. So without further ado, let's hop into it. Make sure you click that like and subscribe button. We really appreciate it. We've been posting daily fantasy football videos for the last month or so. So make sure you are checking out all of those videos in the playlist. And like I said, we got some more NFL content coming your way pretty much every single week. We're going to have our favorite bets of the week, over, under, spreads, player props, you name it. We got all of that content coming your way. Now, I could start this video by saying, don't draft Saquon Barkley. There's injury risk, or Tyreek Hill, especially in PPR leagues. We aren't going to say those guys. Those guys are absolute studs. But instead, we're going to start off with the Washington football team. Antonio Gibson, currently being picked as running back 12 off the board, pick 19. Now, I love the talent, and I do have faith in the player, but I think he's getting a little too high, and I'm not necessarily entirely sold on the workload here. Now, Gibson, he had a pretty good rookie season for fantasy football terms and regular real-life football. He was running back 13 last season, and he's being drafted just as such. I mean, running back 12, running back 13 last season. Now, Gibson's fantasy value was very, very correlated to his touchdowns. I mean, the man had 11 touchdowns last year, and I do think he's gonna have some regression this year. I mean, maybe he gets around 7 or so. Now, if you look at it, in weeks 10 through 12 last season, he had 6 touchdowns alone. 6 of his 11 came in just 3 weeks. And if you remember, he had 3 touchdowns on Thanksgiving Day, carrying a lot of people to a victory that week. Now, if you look at it, J.D. McKissic, people love him, they hate him, whatever. Like it or not, he's still going to play a big role in this offense. Now, he still wouldn't be on the team if they didn't plan on using him, and he's a great pass catcher. That's why the Washington football used him. I think they'll be using him a lot of times this season. Now, you look at Antonio Gibson, just finished with 36 receptions last year, played only 47% of the snaps. I just don't know if they're necessarily going to go into a full workhorse back like people are thinking a running back 13. I think you can find better players out there than him. I mean, you're looking at ADP pick 19. You're passing up on guys like Calvin Ridley, who or even Najee Harris going a couple picks earlier. Guys that I think have a big workload like Najee Harris, guaranteed, or a guy like Calvin Ridley who has potential to be the #1 wide receiver in fantasy. Don't think that's the case for Antonio Gibson, which is why you'll all see me passing on him in a lot of drafts. Now the next guy, A.J. Brown, currently being picked wide receiver 7 or pick 25. Now A.J. Brown, he's one of the most fun, exciting dudes, exciting wide receivers and players in general to have on your fantasy football team. But I'm still going to be avoiding him, and here's why. Now, A.J. Brown, he's not known as that guy that's going to go out there and get 100+ receptions. That's not his MO. He had 70 receptions last year, and 10 of them came in week 17 when your fantasy football season was likely over. So you're talking about 60 receptions over the normal 16-week fantasy football season. Now, last year, he did finish as wide receiver 12, so you see him moved up way higher. He's now wide receiver 7. That's where he's getting picked. He had basically the same amount of points as Mike Evans, Keenan Allen, Robert Woods. And I know the critics are going to be like, well, he had the same amount of points, but he missed 2 games. Yeah, so did Keenan Allen. They both finished with the same amount of points. Now, I get it. A.J. Brown's a physical player. That's what makes him fun to watch. But that leads to a lot of injuries, and that's what he struggled with all last year. He had injuries. I mean, he was always questionable every week. He still played, and props to him for playing through the injuries, but he was still injured nonetheless. And this year, unlike any other, he's got another knee injury popping up on the radar. Also, last year, he ended the season with 5 or less receptions in 8 of the final 10 games. And he's already on a team that doesn't pass a lot. Now, sure, he had a 28% target share, but Julio Jones is coming in. And, we see Corey Davis and Jonnu Smith both depart. I think he'll still get a big target share, but this is still a team that wants to run first. They're still got Derrick Henry, and that's going to be their MO, to run the football. So I'm normally going to be passing on A.J. Brown for guys like Justin Jefferson and Darren Waller at the same ADP, pick 25 and 26. I'd rather those guys, I think they got a much higher floor every single week in fantasy football, and that's what I'm looking for in rounds 2 and 3, which is where you're going to be drafting A.J. Brown. Moving on to a running back, Joe Mixon, running back 13, pick 26. So I've already talked about him, my 3 top 20 running backs to avoid, and Joe Mixon is right back here. I'm going to talk about it. Last year, I beat the drum for Joe Mixon. I thought, with Burrow there, I thought he'd have a really good fantasy football season, and yeah, I was absolutely wrong. And while an injury played a big role in that, he did miss the final 10 games of the season, and if you, like myself, had Joe Mixon on your roster, it was probably one of the most frustrating because they never really ruled him out. They would rule him out every Friday, and they wouldn't say, put him on IR, just say, this guy's done for the year. He kept trying to come back, which props to him for trying, but he never came back, and he was just sitting on your roster for 10 weeks. Now, an injury played a large role in it, but if you look at it you look at how good he was in the beginning of the season, a lot of his points came all in one game. The rest of the games, he didn't look all too good. The offensive line, I think, will still be pretty shaky this year, and I think it'll still be maybe better than last year, but they passed on Penei Sewell to draft Jamar Chase, so what are you going to do? I mean, you got guys around him like CEH, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, DeAndre Swift, Miles Sanders, David Montgomery, all going 10 to 20 picks after him, when I think they all have the same question marks as Joe Mixon. Just don't think this is the guy that I want to be taking a lot of equity in here. I do like the Bengals receivers like T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd. I think they got great value at their current ADPs. And you got the wrong guy if you think I'm going to be starting 2 Bengals players like I was last year. Absolutely not doing that again. Moving on to a guy I just mentioned, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I'm going to try to avoid him. He's being picked as running back 14, pick 28. And I love Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I was on the hype train last year like a lot of people. This guy was getting taken in the first round, and boy, was he a disappointment. And he still had a decent fantasy football season, but just not where he was getting drafted. I mean, now it's more accurate with where he should be getting drafted, running back 14 or so. I just don't think I want to get in on this Clyde Edwards-Helaire train. I mean, the Chiefs tried to use him as the goal line back last year. That didn't work out too well. I mean, he ended up with 5 touchdowns, and while I expect that number to maybe increase to 6, 7 touchdowns, I still don't think he's going to be used as a goal line back. You're not going to get a lot of those touchdowns. Now, he manages 2 top 10 fantasy football running back in terms of running back scoring in just the 13 games that he played. I know the Chiefs really like Darrell Williams, and of course, Jerick McKinnon. If he makes the team, he's going to be a very annoying player to watch if you're a Clyde Edwards-Helaire owner or anything like that. I feel like the guys behind him, like I just talked about with Joe Mixon, guys like Miles Sanders, David Montgomery, even J.K. Dobbins are all going to finish around the same tier. And I wouldn't even blame anyone for drafting any of those 3 guys above CEH. And those guys are going a full 1 to 2 rounds after him. Yeah, Clyde Edwards-Helaire getting a little overdrafted in my opinion. Now, the number 5 guy I'm going to talk about might raise some eyebrows. George Kittle. Now, before the stands come at me, George Kittle being taken as tight end 3, pick 28. I know, George Kittle in 2018 finished as tight end 3, tight end 2 in 2019, 2020, disappointment. I mean, sure, he missed 8 games, and that was the reason why. But if you look at it, George Kittle at tight end 3, and that's why I'm skipping him, because you're looking at pick 28. This guy last year, his production, even when he played, so we'll disregard the games he played, his production was erratic. Sure, he scored 24 and 40 PPR points in 2 games, but he only managed one other top 12 tight end week the rest of his other 6 games. That's not someone I'm looking for at tight end 3. You have to think about the 49ers. They got a lot of mouths to feed, and this is a team that run first. That's their motto, that we're going to run the ball first. You already got Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel out there, who I both like to have pretty good fantasy seasons. I just don't think this offense is sustainable for 3 good fantasy football people. Now, last but not least, that I still do think, and if you check my rankings, which will come out on Monday and Tuesday, I still will have Kittle as my tight end 3. But it's just saying I don't like him at this current ADP. I think it's a little too high. I think there's a big gap between Kelsey and Waller than there is to Kittle. No offense to him. I mean, he's been very good. I just think there's a lot of mouths to feed, and this is a run-first team. Last but not least, Kittle has never had more than 5 touchdowns in a single season. Now, maybe he's due a huge season. Maybe he watches this video and he's like, all right, bet I'm going to have a good year. I just don't think I'm going to be in on the George Kittle train. I just think he'll still probably end up as tight end 3, but I just think there's a big gap between those 2 guys, and that's why I'm going to be avoiding on him. Maybe taking a guy like Keenan Allen or Terry McLaurin and taking a tight end, maybe like Mark Andrews or someone along that nature a couple rounds later. Moving on to number 6, Adam Thielen. Wide receiver 16, currently being pick 45. So I love the talent, I love the career path of Adam Thielen. It's hard not to root for him. If you've watched his story, you know how inspirational this guy is. But last year, he was a touchdown magnet. 14 touchdowns in 2020, 20 end zone targets, which was 3 more than any other player in the NFL. I just think if you wanted a guy that's the candidate for touchdown regression, here's your man, Adam Thielen. This is a guy that had 4 or fewer receptions in 9 of his 15 games last season. Just not someone I'm looking for at wide receiver 2 personally. Someone that I'm going to be skipping on. He turned 31 last week. Justin Jefferson, probably the wide receiver 1 that you want in this offense. And I'm just not going to be relying on him as a wide receiver 2. I think his floor is pretty low. He does have a high ceiling, but low floor and not something I'm looking for. Amari Cooper is my preferred target at this spot. Now, he is going a couple picks earlier. Now, I do think he's in the right realm of possibility. I mean, he's with the Chris Godwins and Julio Jones of the world, so I think he's in the right ranking spot. Just a guy that I'm normally trying to pivot off of. I'm not trying to take a lot of Adam Thielen at his current ADP. Moved on to another guy, number 7, Tyler Lockett, currently being picked wide receiver 19, pick 52. This might come as a surprise. If you watched yesterday's video, I was hyping up Tyler Lockett, and I'm basically going to use copy and paste what I talked about yesterday. When we talked about him, I was choosing one player that would outperform their ADP. Now, Tyler Lockett, I do think he will outperform his ADP. I think he'll be a top 18 wide receivers, which would be outperforming his ADP because he's wide receiver 19 currently going off the board. But it's going to be the most frustrating top 18 receiver that you'll ever see. Now, we talked about it. He's the epitome of boom or bust. That's his MO. And I'm going to use a bunch of stats that ESPN has gathered and put on his player profile because I think they're really good. So shout out to him for those. Tyler Lockett at 3 ridiculous games last year. 30 plus, like a 57 plus point fantasy football outing. But you take those three games, that accounted for 46% of his fantasy football points. Yes, 46% came in 3 weeks. The other 13 games, or however many other games, I think he played all 16. Other 13 games only accounted for 54%. Yeah, that was ridiculous. And in those 3 games, he accounted for 8 of his 10 touchdowns. Now, over the remaining 13 weeks, this guy was wide receiver 32. He had 9 finishes of the 40th wide receiver, or even worse in fantasy football that week. This is a guy that will win you some weeks, but will absolutely kill you some other weeks, and just not a guy that I'm trying to get on my roster. I think he'll score more points than his ADP will suggest, but just not a guy you want to be relying on. You'll be like, all right, I only need 10 points out of this guy to win my week. Yeah, I'll probably get you like 3 that week. That's just what Tyler Lockett is. That's what I'm trying to avoid him. Moving on, number 8, Kareem Hunt. Now, Kareem Hunt, he's one of the best insurance policies in fantasy football. There's no one better than him, arguably, as an insurance policy for Nick Chubb. But that's what I think he is. Now, Kareem Hunt, he's great, and if he's probably going to be a target for the 0 running back strategy teams out there. Don't mind taking him if that's your case, but I think there's several guys going right after him that I think are better value. You talk about guys like Myles Gaskin or Mike Davis going 10 to 20 picks after him, have more upside weekly and more upside full season. I think in order for Kareem Hunt to pan out at his current ADP, you're going to need Nick Chubb to get injured. And besides, last year, Nick Chubb was not a guy that was injury prone. He wasn't a guy that got injured and banged up every year. Although he does run pretty hard and runs into people, he's not a guy that's normally getting injured all too often. With Nick Chubb active, and you looked at Kareem Hunt, he finished with less than 10 fantasy points in 5 of the last 7 games of the season. Just not a guy that I'm normally trying to pivot to. I mean, you're talking running back 24. He's going in the 6th, 7th, 8th round. Just not a guy I'm going to be taking in a lot of leagues. And if you look at it, if you're looking for a guy that's trying to get you 8 to 12 fantasy points, sure, I guess Nick Chubb's your guy. But just a guy that won't be on the field a ton just because of Nick Chubb out there. And I just am going to avoid him. I'll take a guy with some risk like Javonte Williams, Myles Gaskin, or even Mike Davis, all of which I think have good value, especially in PPR leagues. Those guys will be catching the ball a lot more than, Kareem Hunt will catch them. But I think that, you've got to think about this Browns team. They're going to be ahead in a lot of games. I think they're going to be pretty good. And I don't think they'll be in a lot of shootouts, which is where Kareem Hunt thrives because he's their pass-catching running back, whereas Nick Chubb doesn't catch a lot of passes out of the backfield. Moving on to number 9, we're going to talk about Kenny Golladay, wide receiver, currently being drafted wide receiver 28, pick 76. Congrats. Clap it up to Kenny Golladay for getting paid this offseason, but I'm skipping you in fantasy football. For starters, you're already injured. And that was all your critics last year. He only played 5 games. He was injured basically before the season started. Only played 5 total games. It was an absolute bust last year in fantasy football. While you can't control injuries, this guy's injured again. And while there's even reports he won't be 100% for week 1, you never want a guy to start off the season already banged up. Now, out on top of that, you got a quarterback in Daniel Jones, which I'm not really sure what he is in the NFL, quarterback or even fantasy football terms. Now, there's a lot of wide receiver depth on this team. You already got Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton, you got Kadarius Toney, the rookie, and then obviously you got Saquon Barkley, who's going to be taking a ton of targets out of the backfield. All of this combined, I'm just passing on Kenny Golladay, pick 76, right at the round 8-ish turn. Just not someone I'm going to be taking. I'd rather a guy with upside like Jamar Chase, which I'm not necessarily high on. I'm actually higher on his 2 teammates, T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd. But still, I prefer Jamar Chase, who will start off the year slow, and that one surprised me. But I think by the end of it, he'll get back into it. This is the guy, Jamar Chase, that's still working into football form after being out for a year and a half plus. I also prefer a guy like Devontae Smith or even Courtland Sutton going many rounds later, but they have much more upside, I think, than Kenny Golladay in this Giants offense. My last one, before I get all the slander, it's more of a concept pick, so wrap it in. Patrick Mahomes, currently being drafted QB1, pick 19. Now, before I get slandered, before you go in the comments, like, what the heck's this guy talking about? I want to reiterate, this is not saying that Patrick Mahomes is a bad fantasy quarterback. Absolutely not. I think he'll be the QB1 in fantasy. That'll be reflected in my rankings on Monday. But I think the opportunity cost is a little too high at this spot. I made a whole separate video talking about when to draft a quarterback in fantasy football. If you haven't watched that, it'll be linked at the end of the video in a second. But no one in the NFL has a better chance to score, 5 touchdowns in a quarter than Patrick Mahomes. Throw 5 touchdowns, 6, 7 touchdowns a week than Patrick Mahomes. I mean, that's the kind of talent we're talking about. But you got to think about the difference in the depth at the QB position. If you talk about QB1 and QB10, the difference last year between those two positions was just 2.5 fantasy points. There was very, very little difference. Now, if you're taking Mahomes, which you would presume as your QB1, he's going to be the first QB off the board, then you're going to be passing on a guy, guys like Calvin Ridley or other guys like that are high up on the. I mean, this is a guy, he's getting picked in the first 2 rounds, and I just think that's a little too high. There's guys like Calvin Ridley, Justin Jefferson, Darren Waller, all these guys I think have a much higher. I think those guys have a much better opportunity cost. I don't want to be passing on those guys to draft Mahomes when I think you could draft a guy like Justin Herbert will score and be very serviceable in fantasy football. But you're waiting until like round 7 or 8 to be drafting him instead of round 2 to be drafting Patrick Mahomes. Now, I have a whole other video, a whole other separate video diving into more about that. I will link that right here if you want to go check that out, talking about when's the right time to draft a fantasy football QB. So check it out tomorrow when we talk about 10 different draft day steals that you want to get onto your roster. So check that video out tomorrow. This has been Austin, and I'll catch you guys again tomorrow. Peace out.